It began with mud, fish, and salt. How did a city built on brackish marshland become the world's greatest economic power? At every limit, Venice answered with innovation, and so it built solutions of its own. A city that could not own land learned to own capital. A republic that could not raise an army learned to write contracts. A state that could not draw borders learned to build networks. For over 1,000 years, Venice stayed ahead of its time. A people who began by extracting salt from a swamp built the largest industrial complex in pre-modern Europe, able to launch in a single day a fully equipped ship. Its merchants created the contract that gave rise to the joint stock company. Its government created the first public debt market in history, a piece of paper that showed in real time how much the world trusted the Venetian state. Bank, ghetto, quarantine, and the accounting method that still organizes the world of business, all of it began in Venice. Venice, the beacon that guided the world. Let's keep the Codex Prime pages turning. Like and subscribe as a brief diplomatic gesture toward the algorithm. In 452, Attila attacked and destroyed Aquileia. The survivors fled to the only place no barbarian army could reach, the marsh. There was no plan. There were no resources. They took what they could carry, got into small boats, and rowed to the flooded islands between the mainland and the Adriatic. The water was the only barrier no cavalry could cross. What seemed like the worst disadvantage, no land, no stone, no timber, would become the foundation of everything that followed. 4 cities poured their refugees into the lagoon: Aquileia, Batavium, Altinum, Concordia. People who had lived in one of the most prosperous corners of the Roman Empire woke up to burned homes, ravaged fields, and looted churches. No shelter, no solid ground, only brackish water in the middle of a swamp. They built homes on wooden piles driven into the mud. They learned to read the natural channels. They learned to live from fishing. And it was there that they began to extract salt. In 523, the Roman administrator Cassiodorus wrote about them. In one letter, he requested transport of oil and wine, a sign that those communities were already useful to imperial power in the east. In another, he described the people he relied on. The inhabitants know only one form of abundance: to fill their stomachs with fish. Wealth and poverty stand on equal ground. In 568, a second invasion came. The Lombards took the Veneto and established a permanent kingdom. Any hope of returning to the mainland was gone. The lagoon was no longer a refuge. It was home. In 697, the lagoon communities elected their first doge, from the Latin dux, leader. His power came from the electors, not from God, nor from inheritance. Venice was, from its first moment of political organization, a republic, the only one left in the world, and it would last 1,000 years. With no land, there were no feudal estates. Status and wealth depended on the ability to build and trade. Politics and economics were born from the same constraint. Venice did not begin as a power, it built itself into one. In the year 800, Charlemagne was crowned Emperor of the Holy Roman Empire. Feudal Europe had a new center of gravity. Venice immediately faced a crisis. One faction wanted to align with the Frankish West, but most knew where the real wealth was: Constantinople in the east. The conflict soon turned violent. A war between factions, pro-Frankish against pro-Byzantine. The pro-Frankish Doge was removed. His pro-Byzantine successor ordered the elimination of Frankish supporters. The Patriarch of Grado, the spiritual leader of the entire lagoon, was thrown from the top of his own church tower by the Doge's men. Venice chose Constantinople. Pepin, son of Charlemagne, rejected that choice and tried to take Venice by force. He invaded the lagoon with a large Frankish army. He captured Malamocco, the Venetian capital on the Lido. The population fled to the central marsh islands around Rialto. The most hostile part of the lagoon. Pepin tried to cross the canals using planks. His cavalry panicked and fell into the water. Disease finished what the lagoon had begun. Pepin withdrew, defeated by the lagoon. While feudal Europe organized itself around land, armies, and inheritance, Venice followed another path. With no land to farm, its most valuable asset became mobility. With no castles, its defense became the water. With no landed aristocracy, its elite emerged from trade. While feudal lords counted acres, the Venetians counted voyages. Their world was made of routes, cargo, and ships. Everything there came from practical answers to real problems. In 992, Emperor Basil II granted the Venetians a decree that reduced their customs duties across the Byzantine Empire. It was preferential access to the largest market in the world. Venice fought for Byzantium with its ships and was rewarded with commercial privileges. For 500 years, Venice built a mercantile machine. When Byzantium opened the empire to it with privileges, it was already ready to scale. Then, in 1171, Constantinople, its ally, did what no enemy had ever imagined. The relationship had been deteriorating for years. Venice made the mistake of believing its privileged position beside its greatest ally was guaranteed when it refused Emperor Manuel I's request for support in a campaign to invade southern Italy. Wounded by the refusal, Manuel I began strengthening ties with Venice's greatest rivals, Genoa and Pisa. The relationship between Venice and Constantinople continued to deteriorate, and the rivalry with its competitors intensified, culminating in an act of recklessness. Venetian merchants attacked the Genoese quarter in Constantinople. That outrage convinced Manuel I that the time had come to remove Venice from the board entirely. Then, on the morning of March 12, 1171, he gave the order. Nearly 10,000 merchants, sailors, and Venetian agents were detained in a single day. Even women and children were arrested. The Byzantine prisons became so overcrowded that monasteries had to be used to imprison the Venetians. The confiscated goods and ships amounted to a fortune that contemporary accounts said could not be measured with precision. Venice had been stripped of its most valuable asset. Not only wealth, but position. When the survivors returned to Venice and told what had happened, the shock was overwhelming. The Republic's response was immediate. Impulsively, Doge Vitale II Michiel assembled the largest fleet Venice had ever launched up to that point, more than 100 ships, and sailed for Constantinople. The negotiations failed. Manuel refused to release the prisoners or return a single confiscated ship. Meanwhile, the Venetian fleet, anchored off the Aegean Islands, began to succumb to plague. The fleet returned home, bringing the disease with it. Venice convulsed. Thousands died. Doge Vitale Michiel, returning to a city consumed by grief and rage, was attacked and killed on a bridge near the Doge's palace. Mass imprisonment, military failure, epidemic, assassination of the Doge, expulsion from Constantinople. Venice had suffered the greatest humiliation in its history. Humiliated and devastated, Venice did what it knew how to do best. It turned failure into organization. The lesson was clear. No one, not even the Doge, could hold enough power to drag the city into ruin.
In 1172, the Venetians undertook the greatest constitutional reform in their history. New councils were created. Old ones were restructured. The Great Council was expanded, and its authority was codified. Procedural safeguards multiplied, not as theory, but as a direct response to what had just happened. For the first time in Venetian history, the people gave up the right to elect the Doge directly. A commission of 11 men, the great merchants, the sapienti, assumed that power. The last direct link between the Doge and the people had been severed. From catastrophe emerged a system more robust than the one it had destroyed. The path toward oligarchy had been paved. At the center of those events stood one of the Republic's most prominent families, the Dandolo. Members of the ruling circle, they witnessed the humiliation up close and took part directly in the decisions. One of them would become the central figure of this story, Enrico Dandolo. It is said that Enrico Dandolo was blinded during a visit to Constantinople, though it was never proven. What is certain is that the blindness was real and it never stopped him. He rose through the Venetian system as a lawyer, diplomat, and administrator. Already in his 80s, he was elected Doge in 1192. In the spring of 1201, a delegation of 6 French envoys arrived in Venice. They represented some of the most powerful lords of the Crusade forming in Northern Europe. The request was clear: a fleet capable of transporting 33,500 men and 4,500 horses to Jerusalem. Only Venice could build what they needed. Doge Dandolo, blind at 90 years old, received them. He asked for 8 days, ship by ship, night by night, horse by horse. On the 8th day, he presented the terms: 85,000 marks of silver. In exchange, 450 ships, provisions for 9 months, and 50 war galleys at no additional cost. Plus,
half of all conquered territories and spoils. The envoys accepted immediately, on behalf of lords who had not even seen the terms. Grown men wept. Dandolo did not. He brought the contract before the Great Council and secured every approval required by the Venetian constitution. Venice did not join a crusade, it equipped one. The contract was the most sophisticated maritime enterprise of its age, a fusion of manufacturing, logistics, credit, and naval power. The arsenal worked for more than a year. Ships were built, crews recruited, provisions stockpiled. Venice committed the full weight of its industrial and financial capacity to a single operation. Dandolo, the old blind doge at 90 years old, decided to lead the expedition in person. The army began arriving in the summer of 1202. It was far smaller than expected, 12,000 men instead of 33,500. The payment fell 34,000 marks short of the agreed amount. The fleet was ready. Ships crewed, provisioned, anchored in the harbor. It was an investment the Republic could not absorb as a loss. Dandolo proposed a solution. Part of the debts would be forgiven if the Crusaders helped him retake Zara. The proposal was accepted. Zara was retaken. But Zara was a Christian city, Hungarian, and under papal protection. The diversion scandalized part of the crusade. Then came an even greater offer. That autumn, a young Byzantine prince arrived at the camp, Alexius, son of the deposed emperor of Constantinople. The offer was simple: restore him to the throne and receive 200,000 marks of silver, 10,000 men for the crusade, and the reunification of the Christian church. Dandolo supported it. The fleet turned toward Constantinople. Alexius was restored, but he could not pay the debt. He was assassinated inside the palace. It was the pretext the Crusaders needed to move against Constantinople and sack the city. Dandolo led the assault from the bow of his ship. The spoils were among the greatest in medieval history. As payment, Venice received 3/8 of the entire Byzantine Empire.
The old doge never returned home. He died in Constantinople in 1205 and was buried inside Hagia Sophia. The man who had lived under the shadow of the humiliation Constantinople had imposed on Venice died in the capital of the Byzantine Empire, buried in its greatest church as a conqueror. Venice's conquest was not born from a grand design, nor from patient accumulation. It was born from a problem of unpaid debts, from a blind negotiator, and from decades of institutional memory. The chain of islands and anchorages acquired was not merely territory. It was the permanent infrastructure of empire, and it would define Venetian power for the next 3 centuries. Thus was born the Stato da Mar. By the 13th century, Venice had built something no city had ever created before. Not just an empire, but a living organism with muscles, a nervous system, an immune system, and a heart. Remove one part, and the whole body collapses. Venice's overseas empire, the Stato da Mar, was a chain of coasts and islands spread across the trade routes to the east: Split, Crete, Cyprus, Beirut. By the 15th century, A Venetian ship could leave its owner's dock and reach the warehouses of the Levant without entering a single foreign port. The empire did not enrich Venice by itself. Maintaining the colonies probably cost more than they returned. It was an infrastructure cost that made everything else possible. The same system that moved silk and spices also moved people. In Tana, on the Black Sea, Venetian markets traded Slavic slaves, and from the sale of those peoples came the very word, slave. Some were taken to Cyprus as agricultural labor. Many young women ended up in Venice as servants or concubines. The trade was banned in 1366, but between private individuals, it continued for another century. Venice pioneered this model. Portugal, Spain, the Netherlands, and Great Britain would follow the same playbook. A chain of ports protecting trade routes. And whoever says ports says ships. Venice understood that, and it built the most advanced ones in the world. The Venetian galley was its main instrument of power. At the beginning of the 12th century, Venice built the largest industrial complex in pre-modern Europe, the arsenal. At its peak, 16,000 workers, standardized components, an assembly line where each team performed a single task along the canal, while the ship moved through each stage until it emerged fully equipped at the opposite end. The result? A fully equipped war galley launched into the sea in a single day. Kept as a state secret, the arsenal was seen by very few contemporaries. Among them, Dante, who described it and turned it into an image of hell, not because it was horrific, but because it was the most astonishing thing he had ever seen. The Venetian galley was a hybrid vessel. Oars and lateen sail, capable of maneuvering without relying on the wind. Fast enough to pursue. Powerful enough to fight. Shallow enough to enter small ports. Each state galley functioned as a public concession, auctioned to Venetian captains who paid for the privilege of operating the route, maintained the ship with their own funds, and received in return the right to transport private commercial cargo. Public utility, private profit, state and market as the same machine. Venice did not leave the organization of its trade to the invisible hand of the market. It organized it as a system of state. Twice a year, the Great Council organized convoys of state galleys to Alexandria, Beirut, the Black Sea, Flanders, England, and Constantinople. Each route had fixed schedules, capacity, and prices. The fleet departed together, sailed together, traded together, returned together. To attack one of those convoys was to face the armed response of the entire fleet. That was how Venetian society itself became part of the machine, from the port to the ship, from logistics to intelligence. No trading system works without information, and in that, Venice stood ahead of everyone. Its ambassadors were, at the same time, diplomats and spies. When they returned, they delivered to the Great Council detailed reports, the relazioni, on prices, troop movements, the health of rulers, and the mood of the courts. Those reports circulated among the councillors and formed a strategic intelligence network that no rival could match. And then there were the merchants who traveled farther than any diplomat. Along eastern routes few Europeans dared to follow. In 1271, A 17-year-old Venetian departed with his father and uncle. They crossed Central Asia, from Persia to the Pamir Plateau, from the Gobi Desert to China, and arrived at the court of Kublai Khan, ruler of the greatest empire of the age. Kublai Khan was impressed by the young Venetian and placed him in his service. He sent Marco Polo through different regions of the empire, lands the Khan himself had never seen. Marco remained there for 24 years. He saw and lived things no European of his time could even imagine. When he returned to Venice in 1295, Marco Polo brought back more than silk and precious stones. He brought information. Years later, captured by the Genoese in a naval battle, he dictated his journeys inside an enemy prison, the book that revealed to Europeans the scale of the Venetian world was born there. The reach of Venetian merchants was not adventure, it was part of Venice's strategy.
As the empire grew, so did the struggle for power. Rich families wanted in. Old families wanted to protect what was already theirs. Across Italy, the republics were being consumed by clan warfare. Genoa, torn apart by the Doria and the Grimaldi. Florence, under the rule of the Medici. Milan, governed by the Visconti. For the Venetians, nothing was more dangerous than seeing a single family take power. Unlike other Italian republics, Venice acted gradually and deliberately. In 1297, the Great Council expanded drastically, more than 1,100 members, around 1% of the population. For 25 years, while everyone entitled to enter was admitted, the door was slowly closing behind them. In 1323, with the Serrata, the closure became final. From that moment on, the Great Council became restricted to the families registered in the Golden Book of the Venetian nobility. A republic that took pride in its popular origins concentrated power in 1% of the population. While in Baghdad or in China, the merchant was subject to the state, in Venice, the merchants were the state. It was there that commerce, finance, logistics, and political power merged into a single system. Stability had a price, the exclusion of those left outside. But the Venetian state did not ignore risks. It managed them as part of the system itself. In 1347, the Black Death reached Europe through the ports of the Mediterranean. The same ports that brought prosperity now brought the greatest pandemic of the century. Venice understood the problem in the terms it knew best: systemic risk. The same infrastructure that distributed silk also distributed disease. The response was to control entry with the same logic used to control trade. In 1423, Venice created the Lazzaretto Vecchio, the first quarantine facility in history, not only for the sick, but for everyone arriving by sea. In 1468, the Lazzaretto Nuovo expanded the system. Passengers, crew, and cargo began to be separated between the sick, the healthy, and uncertain cases. The waiting period, 40 giorni, 40 days. It was risk management to protect its greatest asset, trade, because it was trade that generated the wealth that kept the heart of the system beating. In 1179, the Church banned the lending of money at interest. At the Third Lateran Council, usurers were excommunicated. Venice found a way around it. The colleganza, a financial partnership for a maritime voyage. One investor, the stands, provided the capital. One merchant, the tractans, made the journey. When the voyage returned, the profits were divided.
It was not interest, it was participation. It was not usury, it was partnership. By the 12th century, the colleganza could already gather multiple investors. A single voyage was divided into shares purchased by dozens of citizens. According to historian Thomas Madden, in 1268, Doge Ranieri Zeno held stakes in 132 voyages at the same time when he died. The first recorded form of venture capital, money invested in exchange for a share of the profits. The direct ancestor of the joint stock company and modern venture capital. Venice took this model further than any other power of its time. But the system had a price. Not everyone had access to the capital of the great merchants of the colleganza. For those who needed credit, the options were few. The church forbade Christians from lending money at interest. The Jewish community was not subject to that restriction and began to provide that service. Seated behind their banchi, wooden benches at the Banco Rosso, they lent what the church forbade. The word bank comes from there. The price of that utility was exclusion. In 1516, Venice assigned the Jews to a former foundry district, ghetto in Venetian. At night, the gates were closed. There, the ghetto was born. Venetian merchants developed double-entry bookkeeping to deal with the complexity of those partnerships with multiple investors. Each transaction was recorded twice. Credit and debit, always in balance. Fraud became easier to detect. Profit, calculable. In 1494, Fra Luca Pacioli published in Venice the first printed description of the method. The accounting system that still organizes the world of business was documented and printed there for the first time. Venice did not move only goods, it moved ideas. The same infrastructure that circulated silk and spices also circulated knowledge. By the end of the 15th century, around 1/3 of everything published in Europe came out of Venice. Venice became the greatest publishing center in Europe because it concentrated Greek manuscripts brought from Constantinople and scholars capable of editing and publishing them. The young Erasmus worked there as an editor. The same city that printed the books of the Renaissance also helped invent the market for treasury securities. From the end of the 12th century onward, Venice began to impose compulsory public loans. In 1262, it consolidated that system into a permanent debt, the Monte Vecchio. Citizens were required to lend money to the state, receiving around 5% per year, paid in 2 installments from revenues of the salt tax, and those bonds could be resold on the secondary market as assets with fluctuating prices. It created a liquid secondary market for treasury bonds. For the first time, the value of a piece of paper showed in real time how much the world trusted the state. The Venetian bond had a price, and that price fluctuated with peace, but above all, with war. In August 1379, the Genoese, allied with Hungary and Padua, entered the lagoon and captured Chioggia. No foreign power had ever come so close to Venice. Genoese ships could be seen from the shores of the Lido. Surrounded, Venice asked for peace. The invaders replied they would stop only when they could bridle and stable the horses of St. Mark. The phrase set the city ablaze. The Venetians decided to fight to the end. The government imposed a compulsory loan, the estimo of 1,379, forcing the wealthiest citizens to buy state bonds in proportion to their means. At the arsenal, new war galleys were produced in record time by men who, until recently, had been shoemakers, cooks, and accountants. Now they had to learn how to fight, and how to row, and fast. Inside the lagoon, under the command of Admiral Vettor Pisani, At sea, with Carlo Zeno returning from the east at the decisive moment. Venice struck back, surrounded the Genoese in Chioggia, and forced them to surrender. Genoa would never again recover its naval power. The state issued bonds. The citizens bought them. The fleet was armed. The Republic survived. In 1453, the Ottoman Sultan Mehmed II conquered Constantinople. Venice was losing its partner of 500 years. The Bosporus was closing. New tolls were imposed. From the top of St. Mark's Campanile, the Venetians could see in the distance the smoke of the Turkish conquests. What followed were 16 years of almost continuous war, from 1463 to 1479. The arsenal expanded production. The cost exploded. More than 1 million gold ducats per year. In 1482, Venice issued a new mountain of debt, the Monte Nuovo. Bond prices were saying what generals could not say. A bond that should have been worth 100 began trading at 80, by 1500 at 52. The market was saying one thing with clarity. It no longer knew whether that state would survive. In 1509, the League of Cambrai, France, Spain, the Pope, and the Holy Roman Empire turned against Venice. At Agnadello, the Venetian army was crushed in open battle. Bond prices collapsed from 102 to 40. And at the worst moment of the crisis, a piece of paper that should have been worth 100 was trading at 3. The system survived by very little. In 1571 came Lepanto, the greatest naval battle of the century. The Christian fleet, with Venice as its backbone, destroyed the Ottoman fleet. It was an extraordinary victory. Even so, Venice negotiated peace separately and ceded Cyprus. The system endured almost 200 years of war under maximum pressure, but survival was no longer enough in a world changing fast. In 1499, the Portuguese explorer Vasco da Gama returned to Lisbon after sailing around Africa and reaching Calicut in India. He brought back goods worth more than 50 times the cost of the expedition. When the news reached Venice, the nobleman Girolamo Priuli recorded in his diary what the city felt at that moment. This is more important to the Venetian state than the war with the Turks or any other war that could occur. The entire city is terrified. The Venetian monopoly over the spice trade, the economic engine of the empire, had been broken. Goods from the east could now reach Antwerp without passing through Venice. As Portuguese spices circled around the Mediterranean, Antwerp began to absorb the commercial logic Venice had created. Venetian instruments, bonds, insurance, bills of exchange, commercial law, moved northward together with trade. Venice was not defeated. The world had simply changed faster around it. Venice ceased to be the dominant great power at the dawn of the 16th century, but the system it built still governs. The logic of the Monte Vecchio survives in the global bond market. The modern corporation inherits the structure of the colleganza. Public health systems inherit quarantine. Modern accounting inherits the Venetian method. The Republic lasted 1,100 years, longer than any comparable power in the West. The city survived, but the center of gravity of the world had already moved to the West, and it carried with it every tool Venice had forged.